people just don't realize the system was not designed for people of color. The state and the other defense attorney intended for Johnny not to have a fair trial. They're not playing fair. Y'all will do anything, including compromising your own integrity, compromising your law license to try to convict this guy.
250 interviews?
That's about right. Yeah, it was a lot of them. I probably spent about a month, maybe more than a month, just transcribing all of these interviews and doing research and drafting more motions.
You essentially have debunked what a lot of people tend to think about public defenders.
I know I have not heard this. We had no idea what's next.
That is a powerful, powerful ruling.
I remember the tears just pouring from my eyes, and I get emotional thinking about it now because it's like, I'm just a public defender and I'm just doing my job. You know, I didn't do anything for Johnny that I wouldn't do for any of my other clients.
Welcome to the Iron Gavel. I'm Chris Washington, a criminal defense attorney with over 17 years of experience. Today's guest is attorney Javonna Charles from Lafayette, Louisiana. She has been recognized by her peers for her exceptional legal skills. Javonna was selected to Super Lawyers Rising Stars for 2025. This selection is based on reviews and opinions of other lawyers as to the quality of the legal representation you provide. Our hero in this story, Javonna, found herself entangled in a complex triple murder case which carried a potential sentence of life without parole. The stakes were incredibly high, and she will show us how the case unfolded. But first, let's learn a little bit about Javonna. Javonna, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I am very much a Southern girl, born and raised in sweet Lafayette. I had a lot of family in Brobridge and St. Martinville. So I spent time there on the weekends with my grandmother and my cousins and my aunts and uncles. I went to Lafayette High School, graduated in 2008 from there. Then I went to UL, graduated in the fall of 2010 there. And then I went to the best law school in the state, Southern University Law Center. And I graduated from there in 2014. And I joined the 15th JDC Public Defender's Office in 2011. I started off as a summer intern, and the attorneys loved my work, so I was invited to stay on as a part-time employee. Since I commuted from Lafayette to Baton Rouge, it just worked. We had a Lafayette office. I was able to help out with like research and drafting. And then once I graduated law school and passed the bar, I moved on to become an attorney. And now I am the supervising attorney of our Vermilion Parish office. So I do a whole lot of criminal defense work. I do a little bit of personal injury here and there just to keep life interesting. But my passion and my heart belongs to criminal defense.
So I have to ask, what inspired you to become a criminal defense attorney?
I am one of the younger cousins in the bunch. And of course, I have older brothers. So I'm the youngest of my dad's 4 kids. And I watched my cousins, primarily my male cousins and my brothers, kind of struggle with, as we say, get railroaded by the system, right? They have the classic story that many young Black men have, that they get themselves entangled in petty crimes and selling drugs and that kind of stuff. But I noticed that, you know, their white counterparts were basically getting a slap on the wrist and they were being imprisoned for years. I kind of questioned that, right? Like, why is that? Why am I seeing this inconsistency? What's going on? I need to do something. So that was kind of inspirational to me. It's like, my community needs me. My family needs me. I need to go to law school and get a law license so that I can fight for people in that same situation. And so I can try to change this system and equal the playing field.
So I got to ask you, because you said something very interesting. You notice that their white counterparts are giving a slap on the wrist. I have noticed that in my own practice, like the white clients I get, not that I'm doing anything more for them or anything extra, but the initial offer from the prosecutor is oftentimes significantly less
Yes.
than what it would be if I had a black client, or a significantly better plea offer to than I get out the gate with respect to a minority client. Have you seen that also?
I have, and I actually have a funny story about that. I had a client. She had a name that kind of had a little ethnic flair to it. Her name was Alexa. And so, I mean, I have gone to school with, white women named Alexa, but the prosecutor I was dealing with was older. So he stereotyped it, didn't really look at his file, didn't know he was dealing with a young white woman, assumed because it was a SNAP fraud case, a food stamp fraud case, that he was probably dealing with a black woman. And so his initial offer was a significant amount of jail time. And so I went to him and I kind of sold her story. It was a situation where she had lost custody of her kids. She was going through a rough patch in her life. It just didn't dawn on her that she needed to report that her kids had moved out of the house for various reasons. And so she continued to collect benefits for them. And then someone reported her, and that's how the fraud case came about. So I'm trying to sell her story that, like, look, she's working now, she's in a better place. Can we just pay restitution? Can we try to divert this? And he's constantly telling me, no, 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 no. And I'm like, she has no record. Like, this is isolated. I showed the court records where we could see where custody changed and what was going on. He wouldn't hear any of it. Finally, I got her employer to write a letter basically saying, like, look, she's a great employee. She's doing great. Please just consider keeping her out of jail. So finally talked him down in the courtroom. Like, he and I are arguing back and forth, and people know I get super invested in my cases and super passionate. So he and I are both raising our voices at each other. We going back and forth. Finally, I talk him down to a suspended sentence. He offers her probation. He says, all right, go write it up, get out of my face kind of thing. Fine, whatever. I won. She's not going to jail. So as I am filling out her plea forms, I call her up to defense table so that we can go over them and get signatures. And when he heard me call her name, I guess out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. And when he saw her, I saw his face change, like his mouth literally dropped open, because she's maybe at that time, she was in her late 20s, very good looking white woman. And so he comes over and he says, is this Alexa? I said, I knew why he was doing it. I said, yes, sir. This is my client. This is Alexa.
Hello, Alexa.
And I could see his face. And in that moment, it was kind of like, oh, what did I just do? Like, I should have given her a much better sentence. And so after we filled out the paperwork, he was like, why didn't you tell me your client was white? Literally asked me that. And I said, well, you have the bill of information and the police report. I assumed you knew she was white.
And why does that matter? Like, seriously, why does that matter?
So, needless to say, in that moment, I realized that had I gone in and said, white Alexa made a little boo boo and she needs a get out of jail free card, I would not have had to go through all of that back and forth. But because he stereotyped her as a black woman, he didn't care, And so it's things like that. It's like I got to see that in person and I got to experience it. Like you said, we always hear about it, we see it, but we don't really know, what the backstory is to it. And I always tell people that story. I'm like, please make sure if you got a white client, you tell the prosecutor your client's white because it's going to make your job a whole lot easier. And I hate to say that, but people just don't realize the system was not designed for people of color. It just wasn't. The system wasn't designed that way. And thankfully, we have a lot of younger prosecutors that are coming in. They're more progressive. They don't have that, element of race intertwined with what they have going on. They're not so deep into the politics. But when you're dealing with those older prosecutors, especially in these smaller towns, like I was in Abbeville, you experience it and you have to be very much aware of it.
Right. I tell people all the time, like you say, I actually believe that some of it is like subconscious. They subconsciously are being discriminatory or being unfair and not treating everybody that's in front of them and going through a hard time or a criminal matter the same. So for me, when I think it may be subconscious, I'll remind them or I'll bring them back to a point in time where I had a white client very identical to the black one. And I won't say, hey, I had this white client. I'll say, yeah, you remember Alexa? She is no different than Alexa. And we have to do that. I do believe, and maybe I'm naive in this belief, but I do believe if you point out the subconscious unfairness, many of them will take a step back and do what's right. I think sometimes they do it and they don't even realize they're making distinctions based on race or class and all these other things that should not matter when it comes to the criminal justice system.
It's intertwined in there, and unless we would completely dismantle the system and rebuild it, there's always going to be an element of it peppered
That's
in.
right. That's right. So, how would you describe what you do in just a few sentences?
So I typically tell people that I am the guardian of the Constitution, right? As a criminal defense attorney, my main goal is to make sure that my clients' rights are respected, that we're doing everything quote unquote by the book. That's kind of my work. I am ensuring that my clients receive fair and equal treatment in the system while also ensuring that all of their constitutional rights are protected throughout the entire process.
What are you most passionate about in your work?
My passions tend to change, and people say I get an obsession with different areas of the criminal justice system. I would say right now I am most passionate about those clients who suffer from some type of mental illness, because here in the 15th JDC we don't have like a mental health court that some other court systems will have or some other jurisdictions have. So it's very important that we identify early on those clients who have mental illness or whatever else so we can try to get them treatment. So lately, that's kind of been one of my big goals and kind of my own little personal project, making those community connections so that I can get my clients the services they need so that they don't get caught up. Because you and I both know if you file a sanity commission, they're kind of stuck in jail for months and months and nothing happens with their case. And many times they're competent, they just have some challenges there. So lately, that's been my thing, focusing on how mental health and mental illness affects or can kind of cause crime, because we see that they self-medicate and then they get on drugs and then we see a whole lot of drug crimes. So that's kind of been my thing lately, helping those with mental illnesses.
That's really good because it's often overlooked. We criminalize people who have mental health problems when we should be helping them.
Absolutely.
So, the topic you're going to talk to us about today, why do you think it's important for the public to know about it?
This story, this topic brings in so many of these big kind of issues that we only really hear about on the TV. Never would I have guessed anything like this would unfold in, the small Vermilion Parish, rural Vermilion Parish. But it's important that the public knows and understands that prosecutorial misconduct is a thing, that innocent people do go to jail, and that public defenders aren't these lazy, careless people who have no heart and don't really care about their clients. So I think the story kind of sheds light on all of those big stereotypes that we hear when we think of these bigger cases.
If you had to give us a 30,000-foot overview of Johnny's case, this triple homicide case, how would you give that to us?
The best I could say is that it's a case filled with twists, turns, cliffhangers, surprises, suspense. Like Johnny's case starts off in 2014 and doesn't end until 2022. So this is a year-long saga of drug dealing and violence and this underworld that none of us knew existed. We have all of these different characters at play. And in the end, you have this guy who is being painted as a kingpin of an organization, and he's literally just your everyday average HVAC technician.
Let's talk about Johnny. When you first met Johnny,
So I first met Johnny maybe 6 months after I got a law license. So I was what they call a baby attorney, coming out of law school, ready to take on the world. Johnny had some smaller, more minor charges that were pending. And so, as a public defender, that's how I met him. He was assigned to me. So, he didn't walk in my office gung ho excited to hire me. He was assigned to me. So, we had to kind of build our relationship. And in those early days, Johnny is the best I can describe him as stoic. Johnny doesn't show much emotion. You never really know what he's thinking or what he's feeling. So it was hard for Johnny and I to really connect in the beginning. And that's important to me. I like to connect with my clients because I have to be able to sell their story. So in the beginning, things were kind of distant, I guess, between Johnny and I. And he had charges here pending in Vermilion, like I said, the minor stuff. And then he also had a case in Lafayette Parish involving like some shotguns or something. He had gotten permission from the Vermilion sheriff to have shotguns to hunt, but he was also a convicted felon, so he technically should not have had any guns in his possession. But there was kind of this off the record rule that if the sheriff gave you permission, you could have your guns to hunt. Well, Johnny moved from one house to another and didn't quite comprehend that he was moving over the parish line. So he was no longer in Vermilion Parish. He was moving into Lafayette Parish, hadn't talked to the Lafayette sheriff. And so he kind of got himself wrapped up with a big gun case there. And so we kind of just worked those minor cases. Unbeknownst to us, Johnny was a suspect in kind of a double homicide and potentially a third missing person. We didn't know the third person had been murdered at that time, but Johnny was kind of being looked at behind the scenes as someone who either orchestrated it or had a lot of knowledge about it. So after I had represented Johnny for maybe about a year or so, he was indicted in the first two murders.
when he was indicted for this double homicide, tell me about some of the initial doubts and fears that you had, as well as initial doubts and fears that Johnny may have had.
By this time, when the first charges came out, which Johnny wasn't actually charged with the murder of those people, he was charged with solicitation of their murder, basically hiring someone to kill them. But when we first got word of the charges, we were baffled. Johnny, once you get to know him, he's not really that kind of guy. He doesn't strike you as a violent kind of guy. So my early conversations with him about these charges is like, dude, where's this coming from? And he was just as confused as I was. Like, I don't even know these people. I'm telling him the names of the victims, Cody Fell and Abigail Clark. And he's like, I've never heard of these people a day in my life. So we were confused. And of course, information comes slowly from the DA's office. So I'm trying to get information like, where is this coming from? What is this related to? And I'm getting nowhere. It's not until we started to get discovery that the story kind of pieced itself together and we learned just how crazy life was about to get.
Walk us through how this double homicide unfolded and how the third murder charge came about.
Cody and Abby, as we call them, I feel like I know all these people personally because I worked with the file for so long. But Cody and Abby was shot and burned in April of 2014. So I was still in law school when these people died. But from then, there were really no suspects as to who did this, why this happened. It was, I wouldn't call it a cold case, but there weren't very many good leads. There were two people in Vermilion Parish who were notorious for getting in trouble. And nothing major, but they were drug addicts and they would get arrested for thefts and drug possession, just petty stuff. But they had kind of gone on a crime spree where they had picked up several charges and they were exposed to a significant amount of prison time. So after one of their kind of little crime sprees, they're, interviewing with police about their crimes, and they kind of reveal to them that, like, look, I have some information on a big case or big cases that are in the parish, but I'm not going to say anything until we work a deal. Now, by this point, we knew that Cody and Abby were murdered. That was very obvious. But there was also a missing person, that's Tyler Domain. That report had come out of St. Landry Parish because that's where she was from. But St. Landry Parish law enforcement had reason to believe that Tyler had been in Vermilion Parish in what they were calling kind of her last days. They kind of tracked her purchases and her cell phone activity to Vermilion Parish, and then things just kind of stopped altogether. So they assumed that either she was still in Vermilion Parish or something had happened to her during her visit to Vermilion Parish. So these two people, who was Margaret Gooch and Mitchell Prejan, they approached the police and say, we want to make a deal. We have information on Tyler, is what they say. Because at this point, Tyler's family was very vocal. They remained very vocal throughout. They were always in the news, always, asking for the public's assistance in finding Tyler. I won't say that Cody and Abby didn't get that same attention, but Tyler was definitely at the forefront because no one knew if she was still alive at that point. So there was kind of a rush to find her. So they kind of presented it that, like, look, we have information on this Tyler girl that's missing. And of course, police here were like, we want to know it all. So their attorney ended up negotiating a full immunity deal for them. Basically, you tell us all you know about this Tyler case, and if you know something about Cody and Abby, you can throw that in too. And no matter what you say, we're not going to prosecute you for your involvement in these crimes. Because basically what they said is, we kind of involved in it. That's how we know about it. We didn't really do anything, but we don't want to get in trouble. Now, off the record, let me say what we gather, and that'll become more obvious why I say it that way. But what we gathered is that they had made a deal on all of these charges that they had pending. But all of those charges were not included in the written immunity deal. But they were immune for prosecution for anything related to Cody, Abby, and Tyler. And so shortly after that immunity deal was inked out, signed, approved by everyone, Margaret and Mitch led police to Tyler Domingue's car, which had been dumped in Bayou Teague here in Vermilion Parish. And from the discovery of the car, when the car was pulled out of Bayou Teague, that kind of started a whirlwind of events and kind of chaos in the parish to figure out all of the pieces to this puzzle.
I gotta ask this question because you talked about Margaret and Mitch getting immunity, right?
Yes.
What exactly is immunity?
Basically, what they negotiated with the state, with the prosecutors, is that they would not be prosecuted for any of their involvement in the death of Cody and Abby or the disappearance and possible death of Tyler. So no matter what they told to police, no matter what they told to prosecutors, no matter how deep they were actually involved in the crimes, the state agreed that they would never face any charges for any of these cases that were kind of pending.
So what was your reaction to that when you learned that they were giving full immunity? Essentially, it means if they would have admitted to being the executioners, they still would have avoided jail. What was going through your mind and your client's mind when you guys learned that these individuals were given full immunity?
So it was shocking. Again, I'm a newer attorney at that point. When formal charges came out, I'd been practicing like about a year. So I had only heard about immunity deals like in these bigger cases in law school, but had never really seen one in practice. So for one, I was shocked that Vermilion Parish would have negotiated an immunity deal with anyone. But then I knew Margaret and Mitch because they were frequent flyers. They were always in court. And so part of me was like, how are you going to trust them They're drug addicts. They're going to tell you whatever they need to tell you to get themselves out of trouble. And then when I talked to Johnny about it, I'm like, listen, they have immunity. If there's anything that we might be able to negotiate a very similar deal for you. And he's like, I don't know anything. Like, I don't have anything to give them. I know those people like in passing, but I don't know why they got immunity because I don't know what they would know. And then once the car came out, it's like, okay, now what do these people know? This bayou is, I'm not going to say secluded, but you have to really know the area to get to it. So, in order for Margaret and Mitch to know the exact location of where this car was ducked off, they had to be deep involved. And so, my concern was, like you just said, at that point, we didn't know much about their involvement, just that they were kind of cooperating with police and that the car was found. But my concern is that y'all just made deals with potential murderers. And that's
Right.
what we're doing now. Like, you have Johnny in jail for soliciting the murders, which is bad, but you potentially have your trigger man and your trigger woman, and you are willing to just let them walk free if in the end they are the murderers. So that was kind of concerning too. And then always in the back of my mind, it's like, now what other twist is this case gonna take?
That's
Like, it
right.
just kept you on the edge of your seat because it's like, what is going on? This is all happening in the parish right under our noses. We had no idea what's next, is what we kept asking ourselves.
So let's move a little bit forward. I want to know about some of the initial evidence presented by the prosecution in Johnny's case.
Initially, we got like a police narrative that summarized their investigation up to a certain point. Now, at the point where Johnny was charged in Cody and Abby's murders, or kind of the solicitation of their murder, Tyler's case was kind of in its infancy. They were still actively investigating that case. And soon we learned in reading the report in the Cody and Abby case, we learned that Tyler's case may be intertwined to that. One of the theories was that Tyler potentially knew information about the murders of Cody and Abby, and that could have led to her disappearance and possible death. Because again, at this point, we didn't know if Tyler was alive or deceased. So it was still being investigated as a missing persons case. But early on, we got a police narrative that might have been maybe 15, 20 pages long. Didn't really tell us much. It was a whole lot of hearsay, a whole lot of hearsay. Oh, Margaret and Mitch told us this. So we went and talked to Joe Blow that lives on such and such a street. They told us, yeah, they saw Cody and Abby riding around in a car 3 weeks ago. Like, it was just very vague stuff. But what was interesting is that very early narrative didn't say much about Johnny. Like, I think Johnny's name may have appeared once in the whole narrative. So it was like, how did y'all charge him? Why did y'all charge him? Because at this point, you've interviewed 15, 20 people, and one of them mentioned Johnny in passing. So where is this going? And so it was a whole lot of asking the prosecutors and filing supplemental discovery motions to try to pull that information out of them to figure out, how is Johnny even involved in any of this?
I know we talked briefly early on, and you described going through banker's boxes of discovery, and I believe you said 250 interviews. Is that right?
That's about right. Yeah, it was a lot of them.
Tell me about the banker's boxes. I know there are these big boxes that lawyers tend to stick documents in. Tell me how many banker's boxes you went through. Tell me how long it took you, and tell me what you learned after going through all of those banker's boxes. And then we'll talk about the interviews.
We didn't get, like, discovery wasn't dumped on us all at one time. Charges came in 2016 and we litigated it pretty hard for 3, almost 4 years. And when I say litigated, I mean We're filing supplemental discovery motions. We're telling them there's, things missing. We're filing for subpoenas. So we're getting bits and pieces. In the end, we probably had about 6 bankers' boxes of paper. So we're talking thousands and thousands of sheets of paper. And like you said, about 250 discs. The way we kind of attacked it is we just started from the beginning, going through separating the actual police narratives and reports from any written witness statements that we might have, from maps and diagrams. They gave us hundreds of pages of phone data. We call it like a phone dump, which included text messages and social media stuff. And there was GPS coordinates. So co-counsel Chad Eichert, who was a more seasoned attorney, he really spent a lot of time plotting the GPS coordinates, and we were able to kind of figure out where Johnny and Margaret and Mitch, and you'll learn about Derek Viator, and Red Boy, who was like this mystery man from Houston. In plotting these GPS coordinates, we were kind of able to retrace their steps around the time that Cody and Abby were murdered and Tyler disappeared. And so we really just took it piece by piece, trying to create a timeline, because at this point, there were wild allegations coming from everywhere. No one really knew what happened. And so, from the defense standpoint, we needed to figure out what our timeline was going to be, because the state's timeline was not very clear. And we knew that the state was going to have a hard time kind of streamlining this case because there was so much information. How do you decide what to present to the jury? Our tactic was, let's keep it simple, let's keep it clean, let's keep it concise. So we really just broke discovery down and created our timeline and figured out which pieces of evidence matched with which date on our timeline. And literally, for probably the last 6 to 9 months before we started the first trial, Chad and I were basically locked in a conference room together with all of these boxes surrounding us, with our laptops, listening to audio, transcribing all of these interviews. I transcribed each and every one of these interviews because I wanted to make sure I knew what these people were saying. And during the trial, I wanted to make sure if these people testified, I could quickly go back to what they said. So I probably spent about a month, maybe more than a month, just transcribing all of these interviews and doing research and drafting more motions. So we were on lockdown. Essentially, Chad and I were on lockdown. We didn't do anything else but immerse ourselves in this discovery.
Amazing. And you essentially have debunked what a lot of people tend to think about public defenders. I know a lot of public defenders that do really amazing work and dedicate an extremely significant amount of time beyond what the job would probably even require to, do right by people. And that's great. I do a few conflict cases in New Orleans. So it's funny, though, when I go visit my clients at jail, they always say, you come see us. Most of the people in here, their lawyers don't come see us. You give us a copy of our discovery. Most of the lawyers don't give their clients copies of discovery. No. And then there's this little text message platform that they can text me. Like, it comes through as an email. I respond. So they say, you actually respond when I text you. I tell them, I say, look, it's true. There are a lot of people who are public defenders who they're just there to collect a paycheck.
Yes,
but I said there are a lot of people who are public defenders that really, really care. And, you can't just label whoever gets appointed to you. Like, give them a chance to see if he or she is legit and cares about the people whose lives have essentially been placed in their hands. So look, what you gave Johnny, I bet you give it to a lot of people, because you don't just pull one and, like, if you are like that, that's how you are.
And it's funny you say that, because Johnny had in the past, he had hired attorneys to represent him. So, when this big case came out, this would be a pretty expensive case if you were going to hire private counsel. And so in the beginning, he was kind of apprehensive. But in the end, he was like, I'm so glad. I'm so glad my family didn't spend the money because, I would have even gotten this attention or this representation from someone I paid money to. Because we
Right.
really gave a lot of blood, sweat, and some tears. I won't lie, there's some tears to Johnny's case. We really put in a lot of work.
So let's get to the trial. I know there was more than one. So let's say this trial number one.
Trial number one. Chad and I are still on lockdown. This is probably the weekend before trial is set to start. So typically in Vermilion Parish, Monday is what we consider like a pre-trial date. And then Tuesday is when we begin to actually pick the jury, do voir dire and begin to pick the jury. So it was a Sunday. We had been working the Friday, the Saturday, the Sunday. That Sunday morning, Chad called me and he said, Hey, I'm finishing up the trial binder and I'm missing some of these motions that we've litigated. I would just like a clean copy of them to have just in case we need them throughout the trial for whatever reason. Chad's office, like his main office, was in Lafayette. So he didn't have access to the Vermilion systems from Lafayette. So I said, I'll just run to the Vermilion office and I'll print whatever you need, like send me an email, whatever you need. So he sends it to me. So Sunday morning, I get dressed, I come into the office, and I'm just browsing the clerk system. I don't know what told me to do this because I had never done it before. Aside from Johnny being charged in the double homicide and then in the disappearance of Tyler, because again, this is June of 2019, and at this point, we still had no confirmation that Tyler was deceased. She was still kind of categorized as a missing person. She was presumed deceased because her family had not had any contact with her. There was no activity on her phone or any of her bank accounts or credit cards. And of course, her car had been found in that bayou. So she was presumed deceased, but we didn't know. But there were other people that had been charged as co-conspirators, we called them. So there was Derek Viator, who we always believed was kind of the trigger man or, the actual murderer. Then there was Johnny, who was charged with kind of being the kingpin and calling the shots in all of this. Then you had Brady Derwin and Ernest Ray. Brady and Ernest were kind of these people on the outskirts of the case where they may have known something, they may have helped dispose of evidence or hide evidence. The state's theory was that Brady and Ernest were kind of the link between Derek and Johnny. That like Johnny did have some direct dealings with Derek because they were cool. We had reason to believe that, they were cordial and they were friendly, but that Brady and Ernest kind of played a part in getting things from Johnny to Derek and from Derek to Johnny. They were kind of like the middlemen. So we had these four people that we knew were charged. I was there to print motions in Johnny's case, but for whatever reason, my gut said, see what's going on with Ernest Ray and Brady Derwin's case. I had never done that before, didn't really pay attention to them. I'd listened to their interviews. There was nothing that they really said that I thought was going to be a detriment to our case. So again, they weren't big on my radar. However, I remember telling Chad as we were kind of tearing the case apart, I think there's more to Brady because they interviewed him several times. Most of the people they interviewed once, maybe twice, a quick follow up. But Brady, he was interviewed before he was arrested, right after he was arrested, and then he came in a couple times from there. And I'm like, what is it with this guy that they're fixated on him? But again, Margaret and Mitch had immunity. So from Chad's standpoint, he's like, no, Margaret and Mitch have to be the key state witnesses. Why would they give them immunity and never use them? I couldn't answer that question. I'm a baby lawyer. You know better than I do. But again, back on this day, something told me just browse their files, see what's going on with them, see if there's anything there. I opened Brady's file and I'm combing through. Now, again, I knew Brady was arrested and I knew he had bonded out of jail. I didn't know the details of that. I didn't know how he bonded out. I saw his bond reduction motion. And I said, well, all this time, Johnny's been in jail. He was doing some hard labor time for the Lafayette case, but even then, his bond in Vermilion Parish was like over $1 million. And we tried to get it reduced several times, no success. So I said, well, let me see what happened with Brady's bond reduction, just in case something happens with the trial and we need to revisit Johnny's bond. I'll kind of have a starting point to say, Judge, a co-defendant got XYZ bond reduction. Why can't Johnny? Well, I opened Brady's bond reduction and realized that his bond was reduced by stipulation between the state and defense by over $500,000. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, as a defense attorney, I'm like, why didn't they tell us that? Like, if Brady is subpoenaed to testify in Johnny's trial, we need to know that. That's a deal. That's a stipulation. That's a negotiated deal that we have the right, Johnny has the right to question Brady about, to show any bias to the jury. So I'm like, okay, this is weird, but what do I do with it? So I keep reading through the motion, and in the order, state and defense had requested that the court actually place this bond reduction under seal. And so at that point, my eyes got big and I'm like, why did they want to put it under seal? We never file bond reductions under seal. But just so happened, the clerk didn't read that far because, of course, we never seal bond reductions. So when it got sent to the clerk's office, they processed it as normal and clicked the button that it was available for public view. So in hindsight, I realized I was never supposed to see that. That was not intended for my eyes. And when it clicked in my head, I was like, oh my God, what did I just find?
I know, and you know, that them attempting to seal this benefit that Brady got is a huge constitutional violation. So I want you to tell the audience about your client's constitutional rights that they essentially attempted to hide and deny and violate by filing this in secrecy, because that's what under seal means. We want to keep this a secret. Tell my audience about your client's constitutional rights that they attempted to disregard.
So, as U.S. citizens, we have a right to due process. And part of that right to due process is to have a trial and have a fair and impartial trial, and to be able to subpoena witnesses and cross-examine witnesses. The cross-examination is where we kind of focused our arguments, in that if the state makes a deal with one of their witnesses in exchange for testimony or cooperation, the defendant has a right to know about that deal, because that could create some bias, right? If you're getting a $500,000 bond reduction to come and testify in this trial, you have an incentive, you have a benefit that you are gaining. So the jury has a right to kind of weigh whether or not or how that benefit or that deal factors into their credibility, right? If this guy is getting a $500,000 bond reduction, he's kind of on the hook. Is he really telling us the truth, or is he telling us what the prosecutor wants him to say? Johnny had a right to know about that deal so that he could cross-examine Brady about that, so that the jury could see all of the evidence, all of the facts, all of the circumstances, so that the jury could weigh Brady's credibility and determine if he was trustworthy, if they could believe anything that was coming out of their mouth, and so that Johnny could have a fair trial. So the fact that this was filed under seal and was intended to be secret, the state and the other defense attorney intended for Johnny not to have a fair trial. That's essentially what that told me. It's like, okay, they're not playing fair as much as we are going to court and we are litigating it, because we litigated this hard. We filed a reveal the deal motion. Like, literally, that was the caption of the motion, saying, Judge, we know there are other people involved in this case that we believe have been cooperating with the state. We want to know if that cooperation was voluntary or if there is some incentive for that cooperation. And time again, the prosecutor came into court saying, oh, y'all know about our deals. Y'all know we gave Margaret and Mitch immunity, never mentioning we had a bond reduction on Brady. Now, there was some other stuff that also happened, but it wasn't as significant as the bond reduction. But never did they ever say, yes, Brady is a state's witness and we promised him XYZ. So the fact that the court had ordered repeatedly for the state to reveal any deals that existed, and essentially the prosecutor misled the court and defense counsel into believing that we've revealed all of the deals. And then here I stumble upon this significant piece of information that I never should have seen. It's like, yeah, y'all definitely didn't want Johnny to have a fair trial. At that point, it's obvious y'all will do anything, including compromising your own integrity, compromising your law license to try to convict this guy. It was mind blowing, absolutely mind blowing.
You discover this on Sunday, the eve of trial, and y'all get to court and tell me how you and Chad deal with this revelation.
So once I figure out that Ernest had basically gotten the same deal, this significant bond reduction that should have been sealed, I call Chad and I'm like shaking. I'm like, you're never going to guess what I found. I tell him about it. Chad is he has tunnel vision. So at this point, he is focused on voir dire and, making sure that the direct examination questions and the cross examination questions are airtight. He's focusing on making sure the opening statement is clear and concise. He's not really thinking about going back into litigation mode. He's in trial mode. So he kind of tells me, he says, if your gut tells you this is significant, this is now your baby. You need to research it. You need to write this motion and you need to prepare to argue it before the court. So again, I'm freaking out because this is a big deal. I am making a very serious allegation against the prosecution team at this point. I am basically showing the court that they have been dishonest with the court. And to me, that was heavy, right? Because that could come back on me, right? Professionally and personally. So it was a lot going through my mind in that moment. Like, am I doing the right thing? Did I misunderstand something? Am I missing something here? So I stayed up that whole Sunday night researching and writing and attaching copies of the court's previous reveal the deal orders, making sure that I'm quoting things exactly, making sure the timeline is right, because I am, quite frankly, freaking out about this discovery. And so the Monday, like I said, was our pretrial date. We didn't say anything. It was kind of one of those things where let's just see how things go. We were still kind of trying to negotiate whether or not this could be worked out. So we didn't want to file this and potentially mess up an opportunity for maybe a deal that Johnny would accept. So we just kind of kept it between us. The Tuesday, we actually started voir dire and we started picking the jury. So strategically, Chad said, we're going to wait until the jury is picked. And right before the jury is sworn in, then we're going to alert the court that we have some concerns there. So I still had to stay quiet with my anxiety on 1,000 that I am sitting with this motion in my briefcase that could just blow the roof off of the building. So we get the jury picked. We come in the Wednesday morning, and Judge, just as a matter of housekeeping, she likes to meet with us in the library just to make sure we're all on the same page, get a game plan for how things are going to start. So it's that Wednesday morning that I told her, Your Honor, there's a motion that I need to file and argue before the court before we get the jury sworn in and get them seated for trial to start. This was surprising to her because I had practiced before her my whole career, and that's not me. I am always very open and honest with the court. I'm always very open and honest with opposing counsel that, look, I intend to file this. This is what it's about, all of this stuff. So the fact that I waited until that moment, I could kind of see that she knew it was serious. And so she was like, what is it about? I said, it's about some information that I discovered during trial prep, Your Honor. It'll become, more obvious when you read the motion. She said, well, okay, let's get to the courtroom. Let's get this started. And so we go in, and I actually file the motion with the clerk in open court. So the prosecutor is seeing it for the first time, that the judge is seeing it, and everybody's kind of learning about it at the same time. And so once it's officially filed, the judge says, well, give me a second, let me kind of read through it. And we could see her eyes get bigger and bigger as she's flipping through the pages of the motion. And she is a very animated judge. It's Judge Lori Yulin
Oh
down here,
yeah.
and she's very animated, and she shows her expressions on her face. So when her eyes are getting bigger, I'm like, oh, is this good? Is this bad? Like, again, I'm still baby lawyer, so I don't know. And she does one of these numbers where she sits back in her chair and she takes a deep breath and she kind of looks and she says, okay, Miss Charles, argue your motion. And I just about died. I was like, okay, now I'm on the spot. I got to argue this motion. The cat's out the bag. Everybody knows what I found. I don't know how this is going to turn out. And so I argued the motion. I argued just as it's written, the same story that I told y'all, how I came about it by accident and why it's significant and all this stuff. And so she looks at the prosecutor and she says, what's your response? What do you have to say about this? Because I'm seeing it. It's well briefed and there's attachments. What is your response? And so the prosecutor says a couple things, and the judge basically says, I don't buy that story. That's not believable. It's very clear to me that the order says to be filed under seal. Had the clerk not made an error in the way that they filed this information would have been hidden from this defendant, and it is very likely he would have been robbed of his opportunity to have a fair trial. This is significant, and the court is not happy about it. So she asked me, she says, what sanction do you want? How do you want me to fix this? So when I was talking to Chad and other attorneys in the office, they're like, go all out, throw the kitchen sink at them, just ask for whatever you want to ask and let's see what we get out of it. So I was like, well, Judge, trial's about to start. We had no way to adequately prepare for these secreted burn reductions. I think those witnesses should be excluded. They shouldn't be allowed to testify in the trial because we haven't had adequate opportunity to really explore their bias here. Our investigator hasn't had an opportunity to really explore if there was more there. This is one piece of evidence that we found hidden, but we don't know what else is hidden in relation to these two guys, Brady Derwin, Ernest Ray. So she kind of thought about it and she said, you're right. I am going to grant defense's motion, and I am going to order that the testimony of Brady Derwin and Ernest Ray be excluded from this trial. The jury will not hear from them at all.
That is a powerful, powerful ruling. And I'm proud of the judge for standing up to the deception. I don't know if that's the best word I can come up with. It's clearly
Right.
deception. I applaud the judge for doing that. I know a lot of judges would have pulled back a little bit and just maybe said, I'm going to give you a continuance or we'll resume the trial in a couple of days. But I think her ruling tells us a lot about the kind of judge she is and how she seeks to protect our criminal justice system and make sure everybody gets a fair trial. So she makes her ruling, and what happens at that point?
So at that point, the prosecution team, they're in a frenzy because just as my gut had told me weeks prior, turns out Brady Derwin was their key witness. It was not Margaret and Mitch. Margaret and Mitch were expected to testify at trial, but they really weren't the ones that made the connection with Johnny. The prosecution felt that Brady was the one that could really make that connection between Derek and Cody and Abby and Tyler and Johnny. So at the point where Judge excludes Brady, that's their whole case. Like their case is destroyed. It's completely undermined. So they stormed out. The prosecutor decides that he's going to take an emergency writ to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. So judge decides that she's going to recess the trial while he does that. He ends up getting that filed a couple hours later. And then, of course, we have our opportunity to respond. The decision comes out the next morning, I want to say. The Third Circuit responds, and it was a disheartening ruling, I guess. And I could see that obviously Judge Yulin respected the ruling, but I remember her saying from the bench she respectfully disagreed. Because essentially, what the Third Circuit said was they found a very serious discovery violation. They found that this was a violation that had great potential to rob the defendant of a fair trial. They found that it was well within the trial court's discretion to impose a sanction on the state for violating numerous discovery orders, but they found that excluding these two witnesses from the trial was too harsh of a punishment because it basically blindsided the state and undermined their case unfairly. So they remanded the case back to the trial court for the trial court to basically figure out a nicer punishment for the state. And that obviously did not sit well with the trial court because she says, the Third Circuit is telling me I'm right that a discovery violation existed. I'm right that this man was centimeters away from being robbed of a fair trial. I'm right that I have the authority to sanction the prosecution team for hiding this evidence, but you're going to tell me my punishment is too harsh and I need to give them a slap on the wrist. Like, she was definitely not happy. She didn't hide it. It is what it is. In the end, she said, I will respect the Third Circuit's ruling, but I have to respectfully disagree with them reworking the punishment. The judge granted us a 1-day continuance to try to prep and rework our defense strategy to address these hidden bond reductions. And then the trial kind of moved forward from there.
Let's jump into it. You guys are in trial. Was there any problematic evidence against Johnny?
Up until that point, the evidence that we had received, there was a whole lot of, like I say, hearsay, speculation, trying to put the pieces together. Nothing that definitively pointed to Johnny's involvement in this case whatsoever. So we are in trial. This is probably day 4 or 5 of the actual trial. We're probably about a week away from when the trial started, but that includes weekends. And so at this point, my antenna are still up because I can't trust you. I can't trust the prosecution team because you tried to do my boy dirty by hiding that bond reduction. So I have to stay on guard with y'all, throughout. So we're sitting there, and the witness that is testifying is the person who Johnny allegedly solicited for these murders, for the murder of Cody and Abby. And so I guess I have to go back and say we consolidated the trials. So Johnny was charged separately in his involvement or alleged involvement with Cody and Abby's death. And then he had other charges for his involvement in the disappearance of Tyler Domain. Well, because the stories were basically intertwined, we litigated early on that we would just consolidate them and have one trial and have the jury decide everything at one time. So this particular witness was the guy that Johnny allegedly solicited, offered him money to kill Cody and Abby. We knew that this guy was not the murderer. There was evidence to support that. I think he was in jail at the time the murders happened. So we knew he was not the murderer. But again, they didn't charge Johnny with murder. They charged him with solicitation. So they wanted this guy to come in and say that, yes, when Johnny took me to lunch at Chili's, we talked about him offering me money to kill these people. So we had talked to this witness before. He was what I would consider friendly to us. He wasn't very, adversarial. We talked to him. We'd gone to his mom's house, met with him a couple times. He was cool. He walked us through the whole Chili's incident where, he and Johnny are sitting there and they're just talking about a whole bunch of stuff and just kind of BSing. And he never took Johnny seriously in anything he's saying. Not saying Johnny necessarily offered him money to kill Cody and Abby, but he said, I remember that conversation being very lighthearted and lots of jokes. Like, I didn't walk away thinking I was going to get $5,000 to kill these people. But what was significant during his testimony is that the prosecutor starts to bring him back to a time where the lead investigator went out to a jail and interviewed him. And in that interview, he starts talking about another incident involving Johnny. Now, at that point, we had 250 interviews. So when he says, I want to play this interview or whatever from such and such a date, I'm still kind of combing through, okay, cool, whatever, play it. Once he presses play and I start to actually listen to it, I'm like, I have never heard this interview or this version of events a day in my life. I personally listened to all of these interviews. I transcribed them. So I'm in the trial. I'm flipping. I'm going through legal paths. I'm like, I know I have not heard this. And so I turned to Chad and I whispered to him, I'm like, Chad, I don't think we've ever received this interview. And he's like, are you sure? I'm like, I'm fairly positive. So they open it up for cross-examination. Chad's like, I'm going to try to get more information that may help you pinpoint whether or not we got this. You keep looking while I kind of stall for time. So he's asking the guy, who went out to interview you? Do you remember around the time you were interviewed? What happened? What was the substance? And I'm looking and Chad turns around and I shake my head no. Like at that point, I knew we had not received it. So Chad tells Judge, she's like, Judge, may we please approach? And so she kind of saw the frenzy at my table. So she knew something was going on. And so we approach and I say, Judge, I don't think we ever received a copy of this interview that was just played. And she kind of looks, she says, are you kidding me? No, ma'am. I've transcribed them. This does not sound familiar to me. She looks at the prosecutor. She says, do you have anything that, an email, a letter showing when you would have sent this interview to defense team? And he says, well, I mean, we should, because what we had kind of got in the habit of, we would pick up this, we would sign for them saying we picked up XYZ, or we would confirm it with an email saying on such and such a date, we picked up XYZ. So he said, I'm fairly certain we sent it. I can go back and look. So it was like 10:30, 11 o'clock. Judge said, I'm going to send the jury to an early lunch. While they are at lunch, prosecution team, I need y'all to find me evidence that this disc was provided to defense. Defense, I want y'all to go back and look and make sure, you didn't miss something and that y'all didn't receive it. Yes, ma'am, we got our marching orders. So we then leave. I go through again. We literally went through the pile of discs. We had piles and piles, and we're going through. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm going through all of my transcripts that saved, and I'm like, I don't see it. Maybe it fell somewhere. I don't know. This would be on me if we got it and it's gone. Right. So we get back from lunch, and the prosecutor kind of pulls us to the side, and he's like, listen, I'm fairly certain y'all didn't get that interview. And turns out there is a lot of information that y'all didn't get. Over the lunch break, I talked to the lead investigator, and there is like a whole banker's box of information that was not turned over to the DA's office. So even the DA's office didn't have it. It was still at the police station with the original file.
Was this the same prosecutors who got in trouble for trying to file this bond reduction under seal?
Yes.
They already were on the judge's radar for their behavior, and now they're trying to come clean. They did get that interview. There may be banker's boxes that they didn't have, but at least they had that interview. They didn't give you that. And now we learn there's banker boxes. Just so everybody understands that the prosecutors have a duty to obtain everything from the police and give you a copy so you can use in defending your client. So it's on them. They don't get to punt and say, oh, the police didn't give it to us. They have an obligation to demand the police give them a copy. So I just wanted to interject that. So tell us what happens. Y'all get back from this extended lunch break. And in addition to what you've already learned on the fly during the trial that, hey, y'all didn't turn this over to us, there's more. Tell us how the judge received that and how she dealt with it.
So we meet her in the library because that was kind of like our little conference room. So we meet her in the library and she turns to me first and she's like, did you find it? No, ma'am, we never got it. So she looks at the prosecutor and she says, do you have evidence that you turned it over to her? What do you have in response? And so he tells her, Judge, we're fairly certain defense did not receive this interview. In fact, in talking to the lead investigator, there is a whole box of evidence and information that was not even turned over to the DA's office. So we know for sure it didn't get to defense, right? But we don't know what's missing or the significance of it. So keep in mind, the jury had already heard this whole interview. And just to kind of put it into context, it was an incident where the interview didn't really describe it this way, but the way it could be interpreted is that Johnny got someone to go and basically kidnap this witness, take him to a warehouse, and kind of strong arm him into not cooperating with police. That's kind of the story that the prosecution painted through his questioning and through playing this video. But that really wasn't the case. In talking to Johnny, we got the story. It had nothing to do with this case. It had nothing to do with the deaths of these people. It really had nothing to do with anything illegal. It was this particular guy that was kind of crossing Johnny on a personal level, like starting rumors or whatever. And he didn't get anybody to go kidnap him. The guy didn't have a car. So Johnny sent his friend to pick the guy up. And the friend drove the guy to where Johnny was, and Johnny was doing work at a warehouse. Like, it wasn't this mafia type thing that the prosecutor painted it as, but that's the way it was presented to the jury. So I told the judge at that point, I said, my concern, Judge, is that my client has been prejudiced by this information and by the narrative that the prosecutor has created. And I don't know if, a jury instruction or even, telling the jury disregard what you heard. They're human. They heard it. It's always going to be in the back of their mind. They can't unhear it. So I said, Judge, I don't know the remedy. I think at this point, baby lawyer, second guessing herself, I think the proper remedy is a mistrial. And she's like, that's a big step. And it's like, I know, but I don't know how else to fix this because this isn't on me. And I'm definitely not going to let the prosecutor's misconduct hurt my client. Because if he gets convicted, then that is on me because now I'm ineffective. And now he has a claim against me for not protecting his constitutional rights. And that's my biggest role in this trial, is to make sure his constitutional rights are protected. So she said, let's slow down. She said, have you really heard the interview? Honestly, no, ma'am, I haven't, because while it was playing, I was frantically searching. She said, well, let's do this. Let's recess the trial early today. I am ordering the prosecutor to give you a copy of that interview. You take that interview, you listen to it, talk to your client, and then in the morning, let me know how we should proceed. So that's what we did. I took the interview back to the office, popped it in the computer, and Chad and I are sitting there because I don't drink much, but Chad had beer stocked in the refrigerator for after trial every day. So he grabs a beer and we listen into this, and both of our eyes are just wide open. We're like, there is no way any jury instruction or anything is going to cure this. This is far too bad. We are definitely going to have to move for a mistrial.
We get to court the next day. Y'all move for a mistrial. And what does the judge do?
So initially, we go back into our library because that was our little conference room. We go into the library and she kind of looks at me and she says, defense team, what is your decision? And Chad kind of looks at me because, again, Chad is in trial mode. So all of these things that's going on, he's like, these are your tasks. You go research, you go write. So Chad looks at me and he's like, Javonna, what's our decision? I'm like, Judge, I got this thick motion over here because when I tell you I went through and I basically rebriefed all of the discovery issues because it wasn't just the fact that they hid this interview. It was the fact that we had the issue with the bond reduction and now we learning about a banker's box and then this interview. It was all kind of intertwined. And so I told her, I said, Judge, we're going to have to move for a mistrial. And she kind of takes a deep breath and she said, once I went back and I reviewed my notes and I kind of thought about what that interview really said, I basically told myself that, if I were defense counsel, I would probably be moving for a mistrial. She said, so it does not surprise me. Let's go out. Let's put it on the record. Let's argue it and I will make my ruling. So we do. We go out. They open court. She announces defense team has a motion. I move for the mistrial and I argue the mistrial. And then, of course, the prosecution has an opportunity to respond, which basically his response was, we accept responsibility for it. We know it's on us. But in all fairness, we didn't have the information either. Apparently, this interview was given to him by the lead detective like that morning before it was played. So even the prosecutor hadn't realized, or so he says, he hadn't realized that it wasn't turned over. And so after hearing, the arguments, the court basically says, Mr. Primo is entitled to a fair trial. And unfortunately, from the very beginning, it has been clear that Mr. Primo has kind of been behind the ball in receiving evidence that he is entitled to by law. And so based on the arguments of counsel, based on the law, based on the court's own observations, the court is going to have to grant the mistrial. So she grants the mistrial and she dismisses the jury, and we kind of prepare to start this all over again. So there's actually a picture of us at Chili's. It was kind of a joke because that was the Chili's that Johnny supposedly solicited this guy at. So after the mistrial was granted, the defense team went to lunch at Chili's, and there is a picture of us standing in front of the Chili's kind of celebrating that win.
That's this picture right here we're looking at.
It is that picture that we're looking at. So that is me in the front in the khaki suit looking snazzy. And right behind me, I'm looking at the picture. So it's kind of to my left, but it's a guy with sunglasses. That's attorney Sean Brucker. He was a Gideon's fellow working with the public defender's office. Sean has left us, but he was an amazing attorney. And the very tall guy all the way in the back, that's Chad Eichert, who is one of my mentors and was co-counsel on this case. And kind of the guy standing off to the side, the one standing like Superman to my left, well, really my right, but the one standing off to the side like Superman, and the other three guys, those were interns. They were actually law school students that were there kind of helping us. And Judge Yulin kind of phrased them the suits because they would show up to court and they were all kind of following us, carrying our boxes and, our bags and all of that stuff. And they would file into court in a single file line. And she called them the suits. So she's like, suits, I need you to sit here. Suits, I need you to do that. So that became their nickname. And the suits were really instrumental in helping me do a lot of this research. I can't take all the credit. I would text the suits and say, okay, we're going to move for a mistrial. This is the issue. Get on Lexis, get on Westlaw, send me what you can. So, yeah, that was Johnny's first defense team. That's the dream team, as he calls them.
Especially those law students. I know they got one hell of a introduction to the criminal justice system and truly how unfair it could be if the people who are tasked with prosecuting crimes decide to be unfair or decide to not reveal information or not disclose stuff that they know they're supposed to disclose. Hopefully the suits will take that out into the real world and do justice for their clients. So that ended that trial.
So now we are back to the drawing board. And keep in mind, in that first trial, Tyler was still considered a missing person. We didn't know Tyler's whereabouts. So from what we gather, after that mistrial, Derek, he didn't quite understand all what happened. All he knew was that Johnny was not convicted and that Johnny was not going to prison immediately. And the information that we received is that Derek kind of got scared. He thought that maybe Johnny knew information, that maybe Johnny was going to become a state's witness, and that things were going to start to unravel. Also, during that first trial, we had kind of explored this theory of a hitman coming from Texas and actually being kind of the big player in this case, not Johnny, that Johnny didn't hire a hitman because the phone records didn't show any link between Johnny and the hitman. It was clear Johnny had never talked to him, had never visited him.
I do want to ask a question right here. The witness in the first trial, whose video testimony y'all were not given, that led to the mistrial, was that Derek or was there somebody else?
No, so this was Joel. So Joel wasn't actually charged at all in these crimes.
Okay.
Joel had his own legal issues going on, but Joel was not really accused of doing anything in relation to Cody, Abby, or Tyler.
Gotcha. So now we're on, after the mistrial, we're talking about Derek Viator.
Derek Viator. So we consider the first trial like a trial run in testing what evidence was good with the jury and such. So in that first trial, Chad did a really good job of making the link between Derek and Red Boy. Red Boy was the hitman. At that point, we didn't know his actual name. We now know his first name's Taswami, a guy from Houston. Really nice guy. Actually met him. But there was a link between Derek and Red Boy, and that link was possibly Derek's older brother who had like his own criminal charges going on and was known to kind of be involved in the drug game. So our whole theory was this had nothing to do with Johnny. This is something dealing possibly with Derek's brother, and Derek's brother hired Red Boy, and Derek was kind of the guy who was supposed to be supervising Red Boy. So during that time, after the first mistrial, the law enforcement really started to focus more on Red Boy because we didn't know his whereabouts. He had never been arrested. His true identity was not found. We were able, through the phone records, to kind of plot generally where he was known to be in Houston. And I say known to be because we're just going off of GPS coordinates, right? That bounce off of phone towers. So we can't say if he lives there, if he works there, if he does business there. We don't know. But we had a general idea of where he liked to be based on his phone activity. And so our investigator was kind of able to narrow down who we thought it could be. And that kind of came out through the first trial. But through all this, Derek is learning that law enforcement is now taking a harder look and starting to try to find Red Boy. Derek knows that Johnny's first trial ended without a conviction. So, Derek, in my opinion, Derek was kind of getting scared and didn't know what twist this case was going to take next. And so, Derek's attorneys approached the state to make his own deal. Everyone knew that the state's theory was that Johnny was this big drug kingpin, that Johnny was running a lot of drugs through Vermilion Parish, and that Derek and Margaret and Mitch and Brady and Ray, they were just kind of like, his foot soldiers. He would give drugs to them, they would sell it, they would keep a little bit, they would return the money back to Johnny. That was their theory, that Derek was kind of working for Johnny. So, falling in line with that theory, Derek says, oh, well, if it's Johnny that y'all really want, I can give y'all information on Johnny and how Johnny is involved in all of this. And I can also tell y'all what happened to Tyler Domingue and where her body is. So after that first trial, the trial ends in June. In August is where Derek leads them to Tyler's body, and Tyler's body is discovered in a wooded kind of, it's like a bayou. I guess it's like a shoot off of the bayou, but her body is found in a wooded area behind Brady Derwent's house. So
What?
then, exactly. So then it kind of made sense why my gut was telling me Brady is more of the key witness. It made sense why the prosecution team was so upset when the judge was going to exclude Brady, because I believe they knew Brady, or that Brady had revealed to them that there was more to it than we knew. So Brady was in a whole lot deeper. Yeah, the body was located and recovered from like a little waterway. I guess you could call it like a canal or a coulee, as we call it down here. Just a little, basically a deep ditch, shallow ditch. That's where she was located. And so all of this is happening shortly after Tyler's body is discovered. They officially tell us that they have identified and located Red Boy, and Red Boy is being extradited from Texas to Abbeville, Louisiana for interview and for possible charges. So, in this time, we got a body being found. We have Derek now cooperating with the state and drafting his own deal that I later called a deal with the devil, because in that, Derek confessed. He confessed to killing all three of these people. And in exchange for killing all three of these people, he is essentially gets what I would call a slap on the wrist. I think he walked away with like 30 years. 10 years per body is what we say. The state made a deal with the devil to try to nail Johnny. This is how bad they want Johnny. They've made a full immunity deal with Margaret and Mitch. They've hid tons and tons of evidence from him. Now they're making a deal with the devil, all to get Johnny. And it's like, what is the fixation with Johnny? Why is everybody after this guy who literally is just a family man who works as an HVAC technician and barbecues on the weekend? Like, we just could not get it. So then Red Boy, I still call him Red Boy. Red Boy comes down to Abbeville, and I go and I introduce myself to him, and I kind of tell him, like, look, I represent Johnny Primo, who is accused of basically hiring you to kill these people. And his reaction was, who's Johnny? And so I was like, here we go. Here is another twist to this story. And I'm like, well, Johnny is my client, and supposedly you and Johnny had some deal for you to come down here and kill these people. And he was very polite, and he's like, ma'am, I don't know a John Primo, a Johnny. I don't know who you're talking about. So I called Chad and I'm like, Red Boy doesn't know Johnny, which is great because at this point we knew Derek was the killer. Derek had implicated Red Boy and said that, like, yes, Red Boy was sent down here from Texas to assist me with the murders. Comes out that, like, Red Boy, he really wasn't about that life. Like, they call him a hitman, but I think he was selective in the way he carried out his hits, and he didn't really like the plan that was in play. So Red Boy kind of just stepped back and Derek kind of took the lead on it. But Red Boy was like, I don't know Johnny. I don't know anything about that. Red Boy interviews with police. Red Boy is able to kind of put some more of the pieces of the puzzle together, but Red Boy doesn't give them that connection to Johnny. And so, you can tell in the interview when we're listening to it, they're kind of trying to walk him into that. Who's Johnny? How do you know him? How did he hire you? How much money did he pay? And he's like, I'm telling you, I don't know anybody named Johnny. Like I told, like Derek picked me up. I lived at Derek's house. Like, this is what happened. I don't know Johnny. Like, I can't help y'all with Johnny. So, at this point, Tyler's body is found. Nobody is really able to give good information connecting Johnny to Tyler. Derek gives his statement, but then Red Boy comes in, and the way he lists out the event kind of contradicts Derek. Like, they're not direct, strong contradictions, but it was such that you couldn't believe both of them. Either you had to believe Derek or you had to believe Red Boy. So we kind of went to the prosecutor and we're like, look, although Red Boy doesn't know Johnny, which is favorable to us, he seems to be like the more credible and believable guy. We have good reason to believe Derek is lying. Like, there are GPS records that are contradicting where Derek said they were at certain times. There is serious concerns as to Derek's honesty during that interview. Are you going to blow up his deal? Right? Because part of those deals with the state is that they have to be open and honest. It has to be truthful. They can't just BS their way through it. So we're showing them how Derek obviously was not being honest, and the state was just kind of like, nah, we're not going to go through the trouble of blowing up that deal. Like, it's just not worth it. Yeah, y'all are saying he's not being honest, but, whatever, whatever. So we're like, fine, you keep your deal with the devil. We getting ready for the next trial. So the second trial was actually originally, I believe, scheduled to start in August. But because we had all of these new discoveries, we now have Tyler's body. So it's now actively being investigated as a homicide. We now have Red Boy here in Abbeville, and he is interviewing with police, and police are following up on leads there. We decide that we're not ready to start trial number 2. And so the trial gets refixed to November, and that's what I call trial number 3. But between trial number 2 and trial number 3, all of Johnny's charges related to the disappearance, and now we know the death of Tyler Domingue, actually gets dismissed. So in the end, when we start trial number 3, Johnny is actually tried on 2 counts of solicitation of the murder of Cody Fale and Abigail Clark, and then he's charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to obstruct justice in their death. Basically, there was an allegation that Johnny ended up paying Derek to kill Cody and Abby, that a bag was brought over to Brady Derwan's house containing $5,000, a gun, and a jumpsuit, that Derek picked up the bag from Brady's house, took the money out of it, put on the jumpsuit, used the gun to kill Cody and Abby, then put the gun and the jumpsuit back in the bag, returned the bag to Brady. Johnny goes to Brady's house, picks up the bag, and then drives it back to Derek. Like, that part just never made sense. If y'all went through the trouble of involving Brady as the middleman, why then would Johnny just drive the bag back to Derek? That was always very weird to us, but those were the allegations. So he was alleged to have conspired with Derek and Red Boy and Brady and Ernest Ray to hide this evidence related to the murders of Cody and Abby. And then the fact that he moved the bag or allegedly moved the bag was the obstruction. So in November of 2019, we start trial number 3 with charges only related to Cody and Abby's death.
They had discovered Cody and Abby's body, right?
Yeah, so Cody and Abby was discovered way back in April of 2014. They were discovered in a burning car. So we always, had their bodies. We always confirmed that they were deceased. Their deaths were always investigated as these big homicides. So at this point, at trial number 3, we have located all of the missing persons. All of the bodies are accounted for.
So trial number 3 begins and it ends in a jury verdict, right?
Yes. So trial number 3 begins and ends. We have no hiccups. There's no missing evidence. We've gotten everything by this time. Trial number 3 ends in a jury verdict, and the jury convicts Johnny of conspiracy to obstruct justice and obstruction of justice. They found him not guilty on both counts of the solicitation of murder. But what was so significant in their verdicts is after the jury reached their verdict, we polled the jury and we learned that the verdicts were not unanimous. One of them was 10-2 and the other one was 11-1. So, of course, there had been numerous pretrial objections to Johnny being tried by a potentially non-unanimous jury. And, of course, we re-urged that objection once the jury was polled.
Just so the audience understands is back then there was only, I think it was Oregon and Louisiana were the 2 states where you could convict somebody and send them to prison for the rest of their life with less than a unanimous jury. We only needed 10. It was 10-2 in our state, which, if you know the history behind it, it was the Jim Crow law. They essentially wanted to minimize the impact of the minorities on the jury. So if you had 10 white people and 2 blacks and the whites voted one way, the vote of the black jurors would not count. And it was like that for a very long time. And I'm sure there are innocent people in prison right now because of that. So there was this Ramos case that took it up. It didn't originate out of Louisiana. I think it came out of Oregon.
No, it came out of Louisiana.
Okay, it did.
Ramos came from us.
So Ramos came out of Louisiana, and the Supreme Court ruled that non-unanimous jury verdicts were unconstitutional. And you guys had enough foresight to raise that in Johnny's case in case he was convicted by something less than a unanimous jury. So y'all poll the jury. Y'all know it's not unanimous. Does Johnny get sentenced or what happens?
So the court always delays sentencing so that a pretrial investigation can be conducted. So sentencing was scheduled for like after the holidays. We were in November. I think sentencing was scheduled for possibly January. And during that time, we were filing numerous post-trial motions. And then in January of 2020, so Johnny was convicted in November of 2019. Sentencing was set for, I believe, January or February of 2020. And Chad, he does a lot of appellate work. So he had some insight that the Ramos decision would be coming out in the spring of 2020. And so just kind of like as delay tactic, he asked that sentencing be continued so that we could continue to prepare and such. And so sentencing was continued from February to, I believe, April. And then during that time, the COVID-19 pandemic hits. And Johnny is still in jail. Keep in mind, Johnny is in jail through all of this. He was arrested on these charges in 2016. He was booked in on these charges in 2016. And here it was 2020, and Johnny was still in jail. But of course, he had been in jail prior to 2016 because he had that gun case in Lafayette that he was sentenced to some prison time on. So I believe Johnny had been in jail since maybe 2014 by this point. So it had been almost 6 years that Johnny was incarcerated. But the COVID-19 pandemic hits, and of course, there's a rush to decrease the jail population and try to get as many people out as possible to slow the spread of COVID in these facilities. Well, in April of 2020, the Ramos decision comes out. And like you said, it's favorable to us. They rule non-unanimous juries as unconstitutional. So, based off of that, we all knew Johnny was entitled to another trial, but the courts are shut down, so we can't do too much. We're doing Zoom court. So, we kind of, by this point, the prosecutor who had tried Johnny's cases in 2019, he was gone. He had left the parish and had taken a job elsewhere. So, Johnny's file was reassigned to another prosecutor who didn't really want to be involved with it because of all what had happened, with this case, not only in the stuff that had come out in trial number one, but there was also some other stuff that had happened dealing with discovery and the way Johnny was treated while he was incarcerated. This case was fraught with misconduct and this just shady stuff throughout. And so this prosecutor was kind of like, I really don't want to have nothing to do with this file, but I'm being told I have to handle it. So we decided that we were going to file a bond reduction motion and just kind of phrase it to the court that, like, look, Ramos has come out. We know that Johnny is entitled to another trial. We are deep into a global pandemic. We don't know when this next trial is going to occur. We know that Johnny was not convicted by the jury of any violent crimes. They were nonviolent, conspiracy to obstruct and obstruction. So we don't believe that Johnny's, a threat to the community. All these good things that were thrown at her. And so we have a hearing via Zoom on the bond reduction in April of 2020. And at that time, the court grants a significant bond reduction for him. I don't even remember the exact number, but I remember it being several $100,000. Of course, keeping in mind that she also knew the bond reductions that Ernest Ray and Brady Derwent had got prior. So she's like, if they got it, he can get it too. And the caveat was that at least a jury had convicted him, although we hadn't litigated the motion for new trial, that, there was some concern there that he was post-trial, he was awaiting sentencing or awaiting hearings from that conviction. She wanted him on GPS ankle monitoring, which we were not opposed to. At this point, we just want our guy out of jail.
That's right.
And so she renders the order. Ramos comes out April 20th. By April 27th, we have Johnny's bond reduced. We have his family with the bondsman lined up. We have the ankle monitoring company on standby to get the ankle monitor installed. And on April 27th, Johnny actually walks out of the Vermilion Parish Correctional Center for the first time out of custody in close to 7 years.
And I think we have a video. Is this Johnny walking out?
That is Johnny walking out. So, Johnny's family and I were so close at that point that when I got the call that the bondsman was headed there, I dropped everything and I headed to the jail and I cried the happy tears with them as Johnny walked through those doors. So Chad couldn't be there and Sean couldn't be there. So I videoed this so that they could share in that moment too. And there was definitely lots of hugs and lots of tears. But for us as defense attorneys, the fight wasn't over. Johnny was out and he was back with his family. He see and hold his godson for the first time. He had his own boys who hadn't seen him since they were toddlers. I mean, they'd visit him in jail, but in terms of having him in the home, he hadn't been in the home with them since they were toddlers, and they had no idea that he was going to bond out and be released because, the family, because of all of these twists and turns that we had experienced. We didn't know if, some new charges were going to be put on him and new bonds attached to make it unaffordable. We didn't know what was going to happen. So very few people knew that, Johnny's family was trying to bond him out. So then it was a big surprise to his kids when, he's at the house and they walk through and they see him. And there was just a whole lot of joy and excitement. And as a defense attorney, it made it all worth it, right? All of those long nights and those combing through those banker boxes, in those moments, seeing Johnny getting to hug his kids and enjoy his kids made it just all worth it. But then for Chad and I, we had to snap back into reality that our fight is not over. And if we let our guard down right now, there's a strong possibility that in trial number 4, Johnny could be convicted again and possibly snatched away from his family and sent back to jail. So the pressure was even greater this time, to keep Johnny out. It's like we'd worked so hard to get to this point, and there is still that possibility that he could be sent back to jail.
Before we get to trial number 4, when Johnny was able to attend a function or something when he got out of jail, right?
So Johnny starts kind of integrating, back with his family. He goes back to work. He's able to get a job, basically starts to live a normal life. So during this time, the pandemic is still going. We don't know when we're actually going to be able to try this case again. Red Boy has given his statement that basically says, look, it's not Johnny. I don't know Johnny. Johnny's not involved. We're able to convince this new prosecutor that, like, look, we don't think Derek is trustworthy. You're not going to be able to rely on him as a witness. If you're planning to have both Derek and Red Boy testify, they're going to contradict each other at some point and probably cancel each other out. So we kind of got this prosecutor feeling like if everything was perfect in the third trial and they only walked away with the conviction on conspiracy to obstruct and obstruction of justice, and they were not unanimous with all that you are describing to us, I am not confident that we can get a unanimous verdict on these charges. So let's enter plea negotiations. What would Johnny entertain?
Is it true that because he was found not guilty on the solicitation charges for the double murders, they couldn't bring those charges again, right?
So that was our position. The state believed that, because they had not received a unanimous verdict as to not guilty, that they could retry him. And so we actually litigated that. That was part of the litigation during trial 3 and trial 4. And judge was kind of like, I'm not seeing any case law to support that position. So if we go to trial, we're going to trial on the 2 counts that he was convicted. I'll give y'all another bite at those 2 apples, but you're not getting another bite at all 4 apples.
The defendant has a constitutional right to a fair trial, not the state. During the plea negotiations, it's my understanding that you're only dealing with, well, you're dealing with everything, but essentially you guys are like, we're only going to discuss a plea negotiation with respect to the obstruction charge that he was found guilty of.
So that was our whole position. We're only going to do business on those 2 counts. And like I said, Johnny had done a significant amount of time, and Red Boy, the hitman, walked away with, I believe, probation. And we knew that Derek, the confessed killer, killed 3 people and was walking away with 30 years. So, looking at that, our position to the state was, you made a deal with the devil and he only got 30 years. You made a deal with the hitman who was the right-hand man of the devil, and he's walking away with probation. Again, you have Brady Derwent and Ernest Ray, who have never received any time or any sentence. Their charges just kind of stayed open and looked like they had prescribed by that point, because it was just continuance with no real activity. So it's like you got all of these other people who's walking away with a slap on the wrist. We want the same for Johnny. He's out, he's gainfully employed, he's reunited with his family. We want him out. In the end, the prosecutor wasn't really comfortable actually striking a deal with Johnny, which was weird to me because you made a deal with the devil, but you won't make a deal with Johnny. And that just came back from, all of the major players in the case truly believing that Johnny was the mastermind and the kingpin behind it all. And so we ended up agreeing that Johnny would plead to conspiracy to obstruct justice and that we would leave sentencing up to the judge. So then again, the pressure kind of came back on us to really put forth some good evidence at sentencing as to why Johnny should not be reincarcerated, because that was a potential. He was exposed to that. He was now agreeing that he had conspired with these people to obstruct justice in a murder. In the end, he did an Alford plea, which means that he didn't admit any of his guilt. That's a picture of Johnny while we were waiting for the verdict in November of 2019. But in the end, Johnny did an Alford plea, which says that he was not admitting to any guilt at all. He was not conceding that he was involved in any way, that he just believed it was in his best interest to avoid yet another trial and risk being convicted, and that he would just do the plea. So we did the Alford plea in December of 2020, and sentencing was set for spring of 2021. But again, the courts were kind of backed up with the COVID pandemic, and we were limited on how many people we could have in the courtroom. And the court had actually ordered a pre-sentence investigation be done by the Department of Corrections. So they kind of had a backlog and limitations on what they could do during the pandemic. And so ultimately, Johnny's sentencing was scheduled for May of 2021, which was also the month that his daughter was set to graduate from high school. So we were all kind of on edge that Johnny had missed all of these big milestones in his kid's life. And now he has the opportunity to be there and present for one of the major milestones in his daughter's life. And sentencing was set before that, such that he might miss it. He might go back to jail and miss yet another big milestone. So, anxiety is high. We were all on edge. Johnny's nervous. I'm nervous. We're just trying to figure out, what's going to happen there and how we're going to make this work. So Johnny was actually sentenced about 4 or 5 days before the graduation. The court ended up sentencing him to 15 years at hard labor, but suspended all but 7 years, which Johnny had served a significant amount of time. He had basically served the 7 years and then put him on 2 years of probation. So then the hard work again shifted back to me, trying to find those contacts with DOC and calling and saying, I need this guy's time calculated quickly. I know he has served the time. I just need someone to look at this file and calculate it so that this guy can get out. So after sentencing, Johnny was taken into custody because he owed time. He owed 7 years. And it was up to the Department of Corrections to calculate the credit he had already received and figure out his out date. So I spent hours upon hours talking to people at the jail and talking to people at DOC and talking to his family, just trying to make sure everyone had the information that they needed to try to fast track these time calculations. And Johnny actually was released from jail hours before graduation. So he did
That's
make it to
awesome.
the graduation. Johnny was there and he was able to share in that moment. And that's kind of when his life really started over. Because, when he was out on bond and out on ankle monitoring, yes, he was able to share in things with his kids, but there was always that thought in the back of his head that he could go back to jail. So
Right.
once he was sentenced and he had been booked in and his time was calculated and he was released on parole and probation, then we all could breathe a sigh of relief that this is really over. Like, this crazy saga is really over and Johnny can live his life. and that's what he's doing. He's living his best little life. He got his job as an HVAC tech. He's doing well. He's bought a house. Like, his kids are growing up. I get updates periodically from the kids. Johnny's family is like my family. Johnny's mom still bakes me brownies. His sister is like a very, very good friend of mine. We talk almost every day. Our kids trick or treat together. Like, our families are basically entwined. And it's because we were all we had. We had each other. Like, when I was tired and didn't think that I could listen to another video or read another report, they were there, kind of like, you and Chad are our hope. You have to keep fighting for Johnny. And that's kind of Johnny's attitude throughout this whole ordeal, when clearly everything was stacked against them. He's being put, this is part of the story I didn't tell, he was put in solitary confinement. They tried to tear him down for him to flip on Derek, and he kept telling them, I don't know anything. Like, you are doing all of these things to me to try to put pressure on me, but I have nothing for you. And unlike Margaret and Mitch and Brady and all of these other people, I'm not going to lie to you, and I'm not going to try to piece a believable story together to save myself. I am innocent, and I'm not going to take anyone else down to prove my innocence. And so he, as they said, he stayed solid, and he did his time in solitary confinement. His phone privileges were restricted. He would be moved to these facilities far from his family where he wouldn't really get visits. Like, all of these tactics that, although legal, were unfair, but all of these tactics to try to tear this man down, to get him to cooperate or get him to take a plea to a lot of jail time, and he just would not do it. So, we are prepping for a trial, a crazy trial, as y'all could tell, and we are hearing these stories about how Johnny's in solitary confinement. His phone privileges are being restricted. We're seeing his family cry. We're hearing his family beg, please, y'all got to do something for him. And it's like, we had no choice but to lean on each other. We became family. I would get all the updates on the family. So that's Johnny. That's Johnny's story. That's the chaos and the craziness. But like I said, Johnny's doing great today. And I don't think anyone, not even me, would have imagined how well Johnny would have recovered from this 8-year ordeal that he endured.
I want to talk about a message you received after saving Johnny's life, because that's essentially what y'all did. And here's the message. It says, good morning. I didn't get to see you yesterday after the trial, but I want to tell you that you are definitely magic. I watched you, and although Chad did his best, I saw that you were a force to be reckoned with in your own right. You're quick and intelligent. Out the gate, when it was question of the wording, I watched you grab that big book, flip, skim, and whisper, and was dead on right. I pray that you continue to glow and shine. And thank you. You are inspiring, and that's big without saying a word. You glow, girl. S. Labry. Who was that?
She sent this message right after the first trial, I think, after the mistrial. But she was a college student who was earning extra credit by coming to observe a criminal proceeding. It was like for her criminal justice class. And she came in the first day and she kind of introduced herself. And we're like, yeah, we're about to have this crazy trial. Like, you're welcome to stay and watch. And so she only needed to watch for like an hour or two to get her credit. But she continued to come day after day. Like, she was invested in the trial, and she just kind of sat in the back and observed. And I didn't know her personally. Like I said, I met her for the first time when she showed up in court, just looking to observe something to get her extra credit. And so after the trial, she actually looked me up on Facebook and went out of her way to send me this message. And now she and I are friends to today. Like we kind of follow each other on social media and kind of keep up with each other. And I would send her updates on Johnny because she didn't come to any of the other proceedings after the first trial. But I would send her updates on Johnny, and then I would periodically post things on Facebook because a lot of my friends and family knew that I was dealing with this big, crazy case. So I would post like the bigger things that were happening, and she would see them and follow them. But that message to me, I remember the tears just pouring from my eyes, and I get emotional thinking about it now because it's like, I'm just a public defender and I'm just doing my job. I didn't do anything for Johnny that I wouldn't do for any of my other clients. No, he didn't pay me tens of thousands of dollars, but I had a duty and he had a right to have someone there to fight for him. And so that's all I was doing in all of that. I was fighting for Johnny. I was fighting with Johnny. It was very moving to know that although she's right, Chad did a lot of, as you would call, the heavy lifting in the trial. Because I was a baby attorney and I was intimidated. I had never picked a jury. I had never spoke before a jury. So Chad did a lot of the stuff that most people saw during the trial. But behind the scenes, when the jury wasn't there, I was the one that was researching and writing, and I knew that file backwards and forwards. So when she's saying, when it's a question, I would flip through, yes, because I knew that case like the back of my hand. And so it was just so moving to know that someone sitting in the audience saw my worth and my value to that case without me even saying much. Sure, I argued, the discovery violation. Sure, I argued the mistrial, but the actual substance of the trial, you didn't see or hear much from me. But for her to be inspired just by me doing my job was a whole lot. And I have saved that screenshot. And on my worst days, when I am ready to give up, when the prosecutors have frustrated me beyond belief, and I'm like, why am I still doing this? Why am I still doing public defense work? I can go in private practice. I won't have to deal with this stress. I go back to that video of Johnny getting released from jail and the screenshot after that trial. And I said, this is why you're doing it, Javonna. This is why you have to keep going, because there will be more defendants like Johnny in the same situation as Johnny who can't afford to hire an attorney, who needs a public defender as fierce and as firm and as determined or as you are to go toe to toe with the state, hold their feet to the fire, make them prove their case, and make sure your client is okay through it all. So I love that screenshot.
I love that speech you just gave. And I have a lot of friends who are public defenders that I know are really good lawyers. And they like to say, oh, he's a public pretender. Don't say that unless you really know this person. Don't just label people. I mean, look, what you did for Johnny, I know he's not the only client you bust your ass to save. Literally, that's what you did. Look, I think people need to see this and hear this and appreciate that there are people who are underpaid significantly, who are still putting in time and effort to save other people. The value you don't get in money, you get in the connections you make. Johnny's and his family is going to be a lifelong friends of. My partner and I have gone to trial and gotten clients not guilty, and I've been out to eat with some of these people. I've had some of them come to my house for crawfish balls. The very first person I ever interviewed for this podcast was one of my own clients. And he sat in here. He came to my house, sat in my YouTube studio, and we recorded together. He is my friend. I value him. He was a former police officer. He does real estate and works in plants now, but we've done work together. He's hired contractors and subcontractors to work on some of my properties because I have Airbnb properties. So look, we are just people helping people. Like, that's it. Doctors save lives and so do lawyers. Keep doing what you're doing, fighting like hell for these people, even when they don't appreciate it, because a lot of times they don't appreciate it until the very end. What would you say this case says about our legal system, especially when it comes to complex prosecutions such as Johnny's?
I think that our legal system is designed to move a case as quickly as possible through the system, even at the defendant's expense, right? That the goal is we have these victims, we have these families who deserve justice. The goal is to try to get closure for the family as quickly as possible. But in dealing with a case as complex as Johnny's, this one is a lesson that sometimes you just got to slow down. That, yes, your client's incarcerated and you want them out quickly. Yes, the victims' families deserve some level of closure. And usually that closure can't happen until the court case is closed because they're forced to relive it every time they're subpoenaed to come to court. But you have to slow down when the case is this complicated and you have this many moving parts. It's best to slow down, make sure you're looking at everything, make sure you have everything so that all of this is done right for everybody. I talk a lot about how Johnny was robbed of an opportunity to have a fair trial and how we had to litigate that. But the flip side to that is Cody, Abby, and Tyler's family had to sit there and watch this unfold too. That, from their viewpoint, Johnny was responsible for their loved one's death. And now, through this prosecutorial misconduct, I mean, there's no other way for me to phrase it. I hate to use the phrase, but it is what it is. Through this prosecutorial misconduct, justice was delayed for them. And they were forced to have to keep reliving this each time we tried this case. So, had everyone just slowed down, audited the file, and made sure everything was revealed and there wasn't no shady stuff going on, not only would this have ended sooner for Johnny, but it would have ended sooner for the families. So people just need to take their time. Patience is a virtue. We don't need to rush all the cases through the system. There is time. It'll get worked out.
It seems like that's a lesson for all of us, so prosecutors and defense attorneys. Take our time, not skim, thoroughly review everything. Whatever the results needs to be, we reached and the system works. We don't need the system to fail because Cody, Abby, and Tyler, their families would not be receiving justice, nor would they be receiving justice if an innocent person were to go to prison. And that's what many prosecutors, I think, fail to understand, that the system fails the defendant if he's innocent and he goes to prison. But it also fails the victim and the victim's family because there's no justice in the wrong person going to prison. No. So we slow down and get it right. There's this saying, I read it in a book. It says, to go fast, slow down. To make progress, slow down. To get a good result. And that's essentially all you're saying. You guys took your time that you were significantly underpaid for, time that if you wouldn't have devoted, nobody would have been looking over your shoulder to chastise you about it. I mean, you just care about what you do, and you and Chad, y'all went out and did it, and now this man is free with his family. He's a productive member of society. The families of the deceased got justice because Derek is doing 30 years in prison. Could have and maybe should have gotten a more extensive justice, but that's on the prosecutors for making a deal with the devil.
His defense attorneys were good. They got him a good deal.
Look, I really appreciate you doing this, but this isn't it. There are people out there who need a lawyer like you, like me, but like you. Today is about you and Johnny. There are people out there who need a lawyer like you. So how do they find you?
You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. My Facebook page is Javonna R. Charles Young, Attorney at Law. You can go to my website, www.jcyounglaw.com. And of course, you can call us if you want to talk on the phone. The phone number is 337 516 5787. And we provide representation throughout the state of Louisiana.
I'd love to have you back in the future to talk about another case.
I'd love to be back because I got lots of crazy ones.
Well, folks, thanks again for watching this episode of the Iron Gavel. This is a pretty extraordinary case and a pretty extraordinary result that Javonna Charles and her team were able to get for her client. As many of you already know, my firm does personal injury and criminal defense work. You can look us up on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Our website is championsforjustice.com. Our phone number is 225-383-3800. All of this information is going to be in the description of this YouTube video. If you need it, just pull it up and reach out to myself or my firm if needed. And if you're in Vermilion Parish, Javonna Charles is your girl. So she will fight for you. So reach out to her. Until next time, take care. Have a good evening, good day, good night, whatever time it is that you're watching this.